Hello, my name's Rob and welcome to Swift Slots. So this is part 2 of my series of making my Carrera really go, or at least that's what I hope. So grab yourself a cup of tea and we'll get cracking. Thank you. So now it's time to clean up all this waste material here and cut the slot so that the guide can swing through its rotation. So, with the guide clearance all taken out, the guide is very free to move. It's so free it doesn't even move the bristles of this small paintbrush. So that is incredibly smooth. Also, there's no side-to-side play worth talking about. So the next job I want to do is remove this piece of plastic underneath this guide here down to the level of the sub chassis to give me an extra 0.5 millimeter of upwards travel. It's clearing the tyres with braids, I've checked that, but if I can get a little bit more upwards, that'll be better, because that will give me some room for a spring in there as well, half a spring to give me a little bit of tension on the spring. I'll also take away a little bit of this top here to give me a little bit more drop, and also I'll fit a brace across here and back to here in this groove to strengthen up all around this back piece. So it's over to the milling machine to get rid of this piece here. And there you have it. So we have a bulkhead intersecting the guide holder to account for sideways movement, and we have a rearward brace locked into the groove in the bottom of the chassis which helps support frontal impacts. So this extra piece here should be well locked into the frame now. There's a combination of MEK. Where plasticard meets plasticard, there's MEK, and where plasticard meets this glass reinforced chassis, which it does appear to be, I've used super glue. So the two glues will work together and do what they're supposed to do relative to the jobs that they need to do. Okay, an interesting time to pause there for a moment. So I've just tapered this rear bulkhead and gained clearance for the front axle when it's put back in. So as you can see now, I can actually get a piece of paper quite easily underneath the axle. So there's plenty of clearance there. Now these two angles here have been done roughly, and now I'm going to lower this centre piece down quite dramatically and then make up a new top piece. And there it is. So I pared it all the way down to about 0.5 millimeter below what it was originally. So this stack is the same height as it was minus 0.5 millimeter. Cut this piece of plasticard, drilled a 3.6mm hole in it, and then dropped it down over this rod, over this drill, so that I maintain the original hole. It'll have to be just honed out again afterwards when it's dried, but that's fine. So then I've capped it over the top with this piece of plasticard and all MEK'd it inside there. So I'll leave that to dry now for a few hours, and then I can then trim it all up, neaten it all up, and that will have tied that center block all the way over and all the way through. So that should now be really strong. Okay, some time has passed. This glue is well and truly dry. So we'll pull the drill out, take off the clamps. See, this plate is nice and strong, not going anywhere. Let's just see if this is still There we are. Right, so that is still beautifully free. I've had to do nothing, so that's really cool. So I just got to trim all this back now and move on to the next step. And there it is, the little cap all kind of blended in and looking okay. I might end up giving the whole thing a little coat of satin paint afterwards just to sort of tidy up some of the scuff marks, but I think it's okay. And more importantly, my guide is still quite happy and working nicely. So that looks pretty reasonable to me. So right, on with some front bearings, I think. Okay, so we're on to the bearings, and this poses a small problem in as much as these axles are knurled. Now these axles appear to be 2.2 mil, or at least they measure 2.2. They're just a hair short, but well, whatever. But the knurling expands the metal. So although this might be 2.2 mil for argument's sake, this is actually 2.27. So it's marginally thicker on the knurling, and I don't want to destroy the knurling because I do want to get these wheels back in. I guess I could just glue them back in, they are only the fronts, so that's going to cause a bit of issue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the bearings to 2.2 mil, open up the bearings, the holders here, which are actually 2.4 mil. They're quite a bit bigger than the axle. So here is a 2.4 mil drill, and as you can see it actually goes in quite reasonably. There, so that's a 2.4. so these are quite a loose fit, which you know is fine, but I'm going to open up these holes to get my bearings in and make the bearings at 2.2 mil, pop the bearings in and then broach the bearings marginally just until I can get that knurling through the axle. Also what I'm going to have to do is take off a little bit of material on the backs of the wheels, because when the body goes on they're actually absolutely spot on to the flare of the arch. There's no inset of the wheel, so I'm going to have to create an insert because I want to use top hat bearings, or make some top hat bearings. And on the back of these wheels there's a little bit of a moulding impression there that's, I'm guessing, probably about 10 thou thick, maybe a little bit more, maybe 15 thou. You can feel it within nail, you can certainly see it on this wheel here. So you can hear it. That's my nail clicking down off of the main shaft onto this little sub piece. So I'm going to machine that off. I'm going to machine it off on this one as well, but leave the whole axle in the lathe. So I get that little shoulder off, and I make a set of top hat bearings, and I'll open up these holes and pop the bearings in. I'll do that all on fast forward, and then I'll broach it in normal speed so you can see the broaching of the bearings and the refitting of the axles. Before I refit the axles, I'm going to have to true the tyres. Okay, so I've actually measured this little shoulder here now off camera, and I'll come back to camera to show, because it's a little bit more than I thought. So up into there, slide it down, get it to touch the back of the wheel, and there we are. It's actually 29 thou, which is 0.3 of a mil, which is quite a bit, maybe 25 if I push a bit harder. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take off 25 thou, and then I'm going to make my top hat bearing with a 20 thou thick flange. So there's a 5,000th gap to allow for a little bit of play. So there'll be 10 thousandths overall. So there'll be 1/4 of a millimetre of sideways play. So let's crack on. So there it is, a pair of bearings all made, ready to go on the car. So the shoulder, as I said, is 20 thousandths of an inch, and if I measure that on there, it comes out at 20 thou of an inch. So So there's 20 thou shoulder. I took 25 off the wheel, so that should give us about 10 thou overall, which is about 1/4 of a mil, which is plenty. Now, as I've suggested in the past, a drill doesn't actually drill to the size that it states. So this is a 2.2 mil drill. This is technically a 2.2 mil shaft, but the knurling makes it fatter. So as you can see, that goes on there quite nicely, but it doesn't go on over the knurling because it's 0.07 of a mil fatter than the shaft. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up these holes now to the shaft size of these bearings, which I believe I made them at 3.5 mil. So let's have a look, double check. Yeah, 3.5 mil is what I made those shafts to be. Just there, you can see 3.5 pretty much. So I'll open up in fast forward these two holes to 3.5 mil. I'll put the bearings in and I'll super glue the bearings into place, and then I'll come back to you because I want to then broach the holes out to the final fit, and I'll take you through that. Okay, so the bearings are in, nice and tight and glued in just to make sure. They're a snug fit anyway, but they're glued in there anyway. So on to broaching. As I said, the 2.2 axle, the drill, doesn't actually clear the 2.2 axle because of this knurling. So I need to get past the knurling. I don't ideally want that slop in there, but there's not a lot I can do. I don't want to lose that knurling, and I do have to put the wheels on and back off again for truing the tyres anyway. So I don't want to disturb the wheels more than I have to. So I don't want to take away the knurling. So we need to broach the bearings out, barely. So I did explain in the other video of my Metro what broaches are, but they're basically just very shallow tapered reamers. So I've got a selection of them here, and I've chosen the one I want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it through using the other bearing as a register, and just give it a little bit of a turn, and just basically note the size of the axle and the amount of broach coming out the other side, and get them pretty much the same. So that's about the same, and then we'll just test fit. So not quite. So we'll go in again and we'll open it up, and this time now I'm going to go on this end here. So I'm going to get about 8 mil from the end of my broach and see where that gets me. So that's about the same, and then try again. Not quite, so it might end up getting to the end of this broach. So let's go to within 5 mil at the end of the broach. Not quite. I think this is going to need the next size up. So what I'll do is I'll take that right to the end of this broach, and then we'll see. Oh, that's really close. So let's take it right up to the end of this broach, as I think that will do it. There we are, right up. That's all the way. In fact, the broach is now completely sunk in. So let's just attempt to get that back out, because that now doesn't want to come out. There we are. Right, I'll do the same on this side. Get it all the way. That seems to be where it wants to be. There we go. Right. Yes, that's it. There we are. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to offer this back up to the body. I'm going to make sure that my bearings, there we are, that's looking really good. Let's pop a tyre on just to make sure, as I do want to reuse these tyres. So let's just pop him back on again. That's a nice fit in there. There, you can see nothing wrong with that. So I'm going to offer it to this side. That's perfect. That is absolutely, you can just about make out that wheel has got a tiny amount of play to come out absolutely flush to the arch. So there's a fraction of a gap, which is exactly what I wanted. It's probably about 10 thou, about 1/4 of a mil. I do the other side just to make sure, and that saves me having to push the wheels back over that knurling to make sure. Again, I can actually feel that. That's perfect. Right, so that's the broaching done. So what I'm going to have to do now is put this wheel back on to this knurling, which I don't want to do, but I don't get a lot of choice. I want to true these front tyres up on the tyre truer to make sure that they're nice and round before I finally fit them back over these knurlings into the chassis for the last time. Okay, let's get these front tyres trued on the truer. And plug him in. Fire him up. And that's it. Both front tyres fully trued and ready to go. Okay, so that's the front tyres all trued up. So now we know they're nice and round. Now the trick is to get this back off the axle. Oh, there you go, right. Take off my turning bearings. And I can get this axle back in the car. I'm going to stick it in my vise because there's more control. And the jaws are pretty square. So I'm just going to put this piece of rag just to protect my wheel faces. And I'm going to lower it down in just so that they're nice and square. Everything all sits nice and square. And I'm going to gently do it up. And I can keep it all reasonably square. Just gently do it up. And I can also keep a very close eye on that gap. I think that will do it there. Right, let's just check. Yeah, there we go. Not too bad, not too bad at all. There's a little bit of sideways play there. I think I might just eke that down a little bit more. I'm sure I can get it a little bit tighter than that. Again, I can keep it all nice and square. Keep an eye on that gap visually. And then just there, I think that's okay. I don't want to go too far because it'd be a nightmare. I'd have gone too far. So I might be able to just back him off. There we go. Yeah, that's okay. Right. Yep, I can feel that. There's a little bit of sideways in there. And that spins no problem at all. And that's even without oil. So all that remains is a little drop of oil. So I'm going to put a little bit of oil on this little pallet, pick it up with my blade and just drop it in there. Perfect. A little bit of oil there. Lovely. Look at that. No problems at all. Really smooth. So that's it. So we've got the front axle in place. We've also got the guide done as well, and that gets us looking a lot more like a slot car again. So the next job is to cut out these rear bulkheads to get our massive meats on the back. So that's going to involve a brass plate and some more brass bearings. Okay, this is where this build gets really spicy. What I've got to do is I've got to get these bearings that I made at the same time as the front bearings broached in so they fit this axle. I've had to file down on the lathe these knurlings because I'm going to have to get these knurlings through a bearing. There's no way of doing it, but there's still enough meat to grab this gear, and I might even put a tiny drop of super glue in there as I push the gear on. I think that'll be perfectly fine. So what I've got to do, broach these bearings to fit this axle, and then I've got to drill out these bearings to fit these bearings into place temporarily. Then what I need to do, once these are fitted into here and the axle fits through the bearings, I'm going to screw this chassis down and make two brass hangers that hang on the end of the axle, which will now be sat here, and they'll be short of the wood, but I'll put the car body filler onto the bottom of the brass as I put the brass onto the axle. and I'll leave it to set. And what that's going to do is it's going to give me a register of where the back axle is now. So when that axle has to come back out and I have to chop away these bearings, I'll lose my register, but I won't lose my register when the thing is screwed back into place through the same holes and in the middle of the brass uprights that'll be bonded into here. That will give me my imaginary line back through, so that when I make a cradle to fit in here out of brass and these bearings are then put into that cradle, I can then assemble the whole thing up together and then drop the whole cradle into place using the brass uprights here as my register. The inside of here will be all flooded in glue, so that as the brass goes in, the axle gets trapped or positioned into these holders, and it could be left overnight to set hard. Once it's set hard, I can take it all apart and I'll put 4 brass rivets through the chassis here and through the brass cradle, and that will put back my new bearings, my new brass bearings, in their new closer position, so that I can get these big back tyres back onto the car correctly. Then obviously I'll need to tyre true the tyres down to the correct size to get rid of the excess material, and we're on the home straight. So let me get going with that in fast forward. Okay, so that's all these little brass mounts made. So what I have to do now is remove these 2 screws, get the chassis out and broach these holes so that they fit nicely into the axles. Okay, so that's these brackets now fitting the end of the axles nicely. So what I now have to do is mix up a little bit of car body filler and get ready to mount these onto there. And now I'm just going to put a nice big dollop on the bottom of each one. I think you guys in the US call this Bondo. We just call it car body filler in the UK. So, nice big dollop on there. Hang it off the axle, like that. And then drop the whole thing back down into my jig. And screw the whole chassis back down snugly. So that's it. We've come to the end of part 2 of my Carrera Go Porsche 997 build. In the next episode, I'll be finishing off the chassis and hitting the track, seeing if I've created a monster or a complete waste of time. So if you enjoyed this type of content, please subscribe, and if you could remember to hit the bell, that'd be awesome. Thank you very much.